Good morning, everybody. It's great to see so many people joining. And I'm Carson Cristiano. I'm the Executive Director at CIGA, the Center for Effective Global Action. We're a hub for research on global development based at UC Berkeley. I'm very excited to welcome you all to our third annual Psychology and Economics of Poverty convening. I really wish that we could mingle and feed you and have a happy hour afterwards at Berkeley, but we'll have to do the best that we can during pandemic times. I'd like to invite everybody to add your affiliation to your name in Zoom, just like I've done here. Part of what makes this event so valuable is getting to see who is doing what in this space. So if you go to participants and hover over your name, there should be 3 little dots, and you can rename yourself to include your affiliation in parentheses. Thanks for doing that. So CIGA's Psychology and Economics of Poverty initiative, which we affectionately have termed PEP, was launched in 2018 to help us really gel this community of psychologists and development economists that was already forming to support the use of interdisciplinary methods in tackling some really important questions about poverty. So specifically how living with a constant feeling of scarcity or volatility or even hunger can drive or exacerbate these underlying psychological factors like cognition, aspirations, belief systems, and so on that affect decision-making and behavior, and that ultimately have serious implications for a wide range of social and economic outcomes like health, early childhood development, and then long-term income and productivity. So imagine for a second not knowing whether your food supply will last until the next harvest, possibly several months from now, and the stress of needing to feed your kids in the meantime, and imagine how that stress might affect your ability to plan for the future. It turns out, thanks to research you'll hear about later by Supreet Kaur, Kelsey Jack, and others, that miscalculating how long crop stores will last is a huge problem in rural Zambia, leading to hungry seasons that are really difficult to recover from and that might be avoided with more careful planning. So through exploratory work, PEP researchers are learning how individuals' so-called mental maps can drive certain outcomes or are driving certain outcomes and behaviors, pointing to policy impacts that can help us get past these psychological hurdles. So I'm sure all of you joining us this morning can appreciate how understanding these kinds of mechanisms is fundamentally important in our collective fight against global poverty. And we can help advance this field, we hope, by creating space for sharing tools and insights across these 2 traditionally separate disciplines. So since the launch of PEP, we've supported 22 research projects led by faculty and students across the CIGA network through a competitive call for proposals. We'll continue to do that, I hope. We've led regular PEP lab meetings where PhD students and faculty have a chance to meet to discuss in-progress work, which is really valuable. And we've launched a PEP seminar series, which is public, for presenting new research findings that as they emerge. So we encourage you all to join this. And if you are interested in seeing some of these presentations, you should make sure that you're subscribed to our listserv. So now I'm going to hand it over to PEP Scientific Director Mahesh Srinivasan. He's an associate professor of psychology at UC Berkeley and doing some really interesting work in this space. And he's going to moderate our first session. Go ahead, Mahesh.
Thanks, Carson. Welcome, everyone. We're really excited to have you all here today with us. So I'm a co-director of the PEP initiative along with Supreet Kaur in economics, who you will hear a lot more from in this next 2 days. So my own interest in this space comes from my focus on children's cognitive development and language development. I'm interested in sort of how poverty might affect parenting as well as children's language learning and cognitive development. We're really excited about this conference. This is our 3rd iteration of this event. I think it's a great conference, unique event in being able to bring together psychologists and economists to share advances and build new connections. Really, the goal of our event is not just to showcase the exciting new research in this space, but also to really build in lots of time for open discussion, as you'll see from the agenda today. So I'm very much looking forward to our presentations and discussion today. Tomorrow, we will also have a very special presentation. We'll be hearing from MIT professor and winner of the, I think, 2019 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, Abhijit Banerjee. He'll be sort of taking part in a keynote fireside chat along with Professor Kaur tomorrow at 8:30 a.m., but also you'll have lots of opportunity to participate in the conversation. So if there are things that you would really like to ask Professor Banerjee about, please do think about those now, and we can include that in the discussion tomorrow. So just to get you situated to the presentations today, there will be a number of presentations. At the end of each presentation, we'll have a very short 2 to 3 minute question and answer period. And then at the end of each session, we'll have a longer discussion question and answer period. We will sort of highlight, pin all of the 3 speakers or 4, depending on the session, to the front of the Zoom so that you will be able to ask questions of any of them. But we also very much encourage, conversation across the entire group. If you would like to ask a question, please do use the raise hand function in Zoom, which I believe you can find under the, I think it's under the participants. Let me see, make sure that's, no, actually under the reactions tab. So if you just go there, you'll be able to raise your hand. Once you've raised your hand, we will call on you and ask you to unmute yourself if you would like to say the question out loud yourself. If you have a related question to one that was just asked, we would like to kind of facilitate the flow of the discussion. So you could just actually chat the moderator for that session and just ask that follow-up question, and we will include it in that way. Also, if you would like to not actually say your question out loud, but you would like to ask a question, you can always just put that question in the chat box. Okay. I think that is all of the logistic related points. I will say for those of you who are social media savvy, which is probably most of you, that if you would like to tweet about our events, please use the hashtag PEP2021. Okay, Christina or Dustin, was there anything else to add before we get started? No? Okay. So with that, then, I would like to invite our first speaker, who is Kate Orkin, who will be presenting to us about aspirations, assets, and anti-poverty policies. So Kate, you can go ahead and share your screen if possible.
Sorry. Okay, so this is joint work with a large team of people and an amazing team of research assistants and partners. So thank you to all of them. Thank you also to the organizers of this event. It's very exciting to be at, this was an interdisciplinary paper, so it's great to kick off an interdisciplinary conference. I don't need to preach this to you guys. There's been growing attention paid to whether people's decision-making processes are somehow different in contexts of poverty, and how we need to understand that in order to design effective anti-poverty interventions. There's been quite a lot of economic theory and evidence that suggests a sort of vicious cycle. So there's been a sort of set of particular psychological characteristics, so among them low aspirations, present bias, depression. And there's been evidence and theory suggesting, first of all, that these characteristics may be caused by or worsened by the very difficult circumstances of lives lived in poverty. On the other hand, these characteristics, which may indeed be caused by living in poverty, may also exacerbate people's poverty. So they may, in particular, reduce a certain set of behaviors we're going to call future-oriented behaviors. So whether people save, exert effort, invest in sort of longer-term opportunities. So, these psychological characteristics, if they're low, may reduce the extent to which people are future-oriented, and that may in turn keep them poor. So we're going to focus in this paper on one kind of psychological characteristic, low aspirations, and I'm going to talk a bit about what those are. And we know from a wide range of papers, including people in this room, that these are known to be correlated with poverty. So we have this vicious cycle, and the vicious cycle raises a question, which is, what do we do if we're going to intervene to try to break it? And in particular, what we need to understand to develop effective interventions is to know whether these psychological barriers to future-oriented investment persist when we change people's wealth. So on the one hand, these barriers may just be caused by being poor currently. And then all you need to do is focus on making sure that people aren't poor anymore. We don't need fancy behavioral interventions. We just need good old plain cash transfers or other interventions. On the other hand, these behavioral barriers may be something that people take with them, even if their immediate economic circumstances improve. They've learned to make decisions in a particular way, and that sticks with them even when they aren't poor. And if that's true, then we need more complicated interventions. We need things that tackle potentially the psychological barriers as well as improving economic circumstances directly. So that's a question that's important for policy. It's also a question that's interesting for theory, because it may mean that we, if we do have these psychological barriers persisting when wealth persists, we may have psychological poverty traps, and that would be, those are quite difficult to break. So the question is important, we think. So we've designed this paper. It's a four-arm village-level RCT. It's going to be in Western Kenya. And we're going to combine, so cross-cut, two different interventions, one of which targets aspirations. It tries to reduce aspirations being a barrier to future-oriented investment. And another is an unconditional cash transfer. So I'm going to show, first of all, that there is a relationship among people who are poor between aspirations and future-oriented investment. So we develop an intervention which targets aspirations. It's a video and goal-setting exercise. And we compare it to a placebo and examine effects on aspirations and behavior. So having established that aspirations are a barrier to future-oriented investment when people are poor, we then need to understand what happens when they become wealthy. So we have an exogenous change in wealth that comes from randomizing at village level the cash transfers of an NGO Give Directly, which gives large unconditional cash transfers. And so we're going to compare people who just get the cash transfer to people who get the cash transfer and the aspirations video. So we know that this intervention boosts aspirations when people are poor. Does it still have an effect when people are wealthy? Are aspirations still constraining their behavior? So the interventions, very briefly, both are targeted at the primary woman in the household. The Give Directly transfer has been studied a lot. It's entirely unconditional. It's quite big. It's per capita income in Kenya, roughly, and it comes in 3 lump sum tranches to the woman's mobile phone via an M-Pesa transfer. The psychological intervention was designed, Catherine Thomas worked on this as a research assistant, who's in later in the panel. And these were 20-minute videos which tell life stories of 2 female role models from similar backgrounds to the people who are in the intervention. And they succeed economically by setting high aspirations. So they come from a poor initial position. They're shown implementing a range of interventions that have been used in educational psychology in developing countries. So they imagine their lives, if they'd gone as well as they possibly could have, they identify goals, and then they break those goals into small steps. So that happens in the video. Those are quite inspirational and happy stories. And then people apply those skills in a group exercise setting, and they set goals for their own lives. So these are some of the stills from the video. So we work in a rural area of Western Kenya. So in each village that we work in that gets one of these 4 treatment arms, we're going to sample the poorest households, so those people who meet Give Directly's poverty criteria. And we're going to survey the primary woman, so usually the spouse of the head of the household, on both the household's economic outcomes and a range of psychological characteristics. So very briefly, the conceptual framework just gives us a bit of an understanding of what aspirations are, because this really bothers economists, even if psychologists think that these are a really important concept. So in the paper, we model aspirations as using reference point utility. So basically, we take a standard utility function, and this is, I say we, this has been done by a number of theorists who are better at that side of things than we are. And so they basically take a normal utility function, and they say, well, people actually get a payoff when they hit their goal, which is something all of us can agree with. And so you get an extra payoff when you hit your goal. So what this framework lets us say is, if you have a psychological intervention that shifts your reference point, it increases your goal, that's going to encourage you to consume less, to have less leisure now, and to invest and supply more labor so that you can hit your high reference point in the future, so that you can accumulate the wealth that you need to meet your high aspiration. We're defining aspirations in terms of consumption for the moment. So that's the first conclusion. A higher reference point will increase future-oriented investment. And then the second thing we get from the framework is that the combination intervention, so the cash and the video, compared to the cash, those are pretty much the same thing, except for this intervention that possibly shifts the reference point. So they're only going to be different to the extent that they have different effects on people's reference points. So the first question we had to ask was, are aspirations a barrier to future-oriented investment at low levels of wealth? So we see, first of all, that the intervention does what we wanted it to do, which is it increases aspirations. We asked the same question you've been asked in interviews loads of times. Where would you like to be in 10 years? So what would your household like to reach on these various dimensions of life in 10 years' time? And we see that so this is 19 months after the intervention, having watched the video and done the goal setting exercise, has positive effects on people's aspirations for their household's income and assets, and then quite a big effect on aspirations for children's education. So the intervention does persistently boost aspirations. And we see some small but still significant effects on 6 families of main economic outcomes that we pre-specified. So we see, investment, labor supplied and inputs go up quite substantially. These are US dollars PPP. So, people are putting more into their economic activity, they accumulate more revenue, and then they are able to improve living standards measured both by non-land assets and household consumption. And these effects are not massive. It's a pretty short video, 19 months later, but they are pretty substantial, particularly on the sort of labor supply and investment. So we've seen aspirations are a barrier to people making future-oriented investment when people are poor. What happens when they get wealthier? So here, this is just comparing the group that got cash to the group that got the cash and the video put together. And we find that this additional intervention to boost aspirations has no additional effect on most economic outcomes compared to the cash transfer. So basically, once you get the cash transfer, adding on this small behavioral intervention doesn't have much of an effect on people's outcomes. We can reject, or we can't reject that these are the same, even though these are measured in different villages. There is, however, one important exception, and that's in children's education. So, like many other trials have found, this is a large transfer, so $2,300 or so. We're not seeing a big increase in families' investments in their children's education, just coming from the cash transfer alone. However, we do see a fairly substantial investment even a year later at household level in children's education in the combined group. And this makes some sense because one of the things that's shown in the video is that the woman who succeeds economically manages to send her son off to secondary school. So we see this, this shift into education investment. And then the final kind of point is to say, well, we have some evidence that this is occurring because the combined intervention changes aspirations, particularly for people's education. So as we said, so I already showed this result in the second column, that people's education expenditure is bigger in the combination group than just in the cash group. We also see that people's education aspirations are bigger in the combination group than the cash group. So that there's a difference between them in aspirations that's then echoed in their behavior. On the other hand, when we look at people's aspirations for their assets and their income in 10 years' time, those are pretty similar between the cash and the combined groups. So the cash almost seems to have maxed out the extent to which people can aspire to higher income. So by the time it's raised their aspirations to an extent that the aspirations intervention doesn't add further to that. So from this, we can conclude, first of all, that low aspirations are a barrier to investment at low levels of wealth. And secondly, that with a large wealth increase, this barrier disappears in a lot of behaviors. So cash does most of what we need to raise people's aspirations on its own, except potentially in the domain of education aspirations. And here we see, if you want to improve people's education aspirations and education investment, a pretty high return on investment. It costs the videos cost about $130 to make, and that's what we see families putting in more, into children's education in just 1 year from the video. So if what you want is to get kids into school from cash transfers, behavioral interventions can indeed help. I think I'm at time.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Kate. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please do raise your hand or put your question in the chat box. Okay, and maybe I'll just sort of, since we have a little time, I'll go ahead and ask a quick question. So it's super interesting work, and I was just curious if you can comment on whether there are sort of potential sort of downsides of using an aspirations-based approach only in terms of whether it's if people have raised aspirations and then they're confronted with sort of systemic barriers later on, what does that do to their well-being? Or if they have sort of raised aspirations, how might they sort of judge other people who are not sort of having increased aspirations? And I guess further, like, could it be something that actually blocks kind of more progressive kind of investment in these communities?
Yeah, so I think so last point first, on the community level investment, we did another study looking at that, and we don't see any differences in community investment in public goods, political participation, any of those sorts of things. So with Michael Walker, we've got a different paper looking at that. I think in terms of, might we raise people's aspirations and frustrate them? This is definitely something that the theory literature worries about. We don't see evidence of this. So the increase in people's aspirations is still in income aspirations. So people still want to get, so they think aspirations, or they think they'll be better off by about $3,000. They think that the return from a kid going to university instead of secondary school is about $7,000 a year. So it's still sort of, where they think they can get to is still less than you would get from just sending a kid to a higher level of education. So it seems that the intervention is pretty realistic. And actually at the very top of the distribution, the video makes people's aspirations slightly lower. So the people who might have been slightly unrealistic, the right at the top, the 90th percentile, actually reduce aspirations a bit. So from that, we don't think that we're making people unrealistic with this intervention.
Okay, thank you. And then I think maybe we can just have one more question from Marcel. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself so you can ask your question.
Yes, my question is about the possibility, which I maybe our psychologist friends can maybe offer some wisdom on that. Is basically the possibility that the things that you describe, low aspirations, present bias, and to some extent depression, but certainly the first two, might actually be an optimal response to a change in circumstances. So you're sent in jail. It's not that clever to think, oh, I'm going to be out of here in a week. No, you're there for 5 years. That's it. You better adjust to it. So how do you adjust? You reduce your expectations. You focus on the present. If you're poor, you don't make big plans. You just focus on survival. And depression, to the extent that it's correlated with more correct expectations about the future, might actually be a form of adaptation. So in that case, if you raise expectations, it's possible that you will induce a small proportion of people to then try and succeed but then what do you do to the others might actually be negative. So it would be very interesting in that context if you had more of a stronger effect of aspiration on the aspiration treatment to differentiate. You see, how many people got better, how many people got the same, and whether their mental welfare actually was reduced in the long term. That's it.
Yeah, so we do look at people at depression, and we see across the whole, so we don't see an effect on average from the psychological intervention. So we're certainly not making people worse off, and actually those who were depressed at baseline are slightly better off. So in terms of well-being, which is one way of measuring utility, I guess, we do seem to be improving people's utility. I think you get at a really important point, which is, you know, at core, how seriously do we take people's preferences? You could say that people are optimizing within the situation that they are. Alternatively, you know, if people are able with small changes in their lives to make themselves better off by, you know, on consumption and these other measures that we know about, sort of through small changes. And, you know, it's quite likely that they might have been very discouraged by structural circumstances from doing those things in the first place. I think, you know, they don't have to follow what's in the video, but I think it's hard to think that the encouragement might be doing harm from the evidence we have in this study, at least.
Thank you very much, Kate. And I'd like to invite Catherine Thomas to share her slides. So she's going to be presenting on leveraging interdependence to advance economic development in West Africa. And I know there's a lot of other questions, so hopefully we'll get into a nice, engaging discussion at the very end of this session.
Great. 1 second. Of course, as soon as I go to present, my Google Slides aren't working. 1 second. I'm sorry about this. Maybe fresh. I'm having some technical difficulties all of a sudden. Would it make sense to go to the next and come back?
Yeah, we could do that.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay, of course. So I'm wondering, so Megan, would it be possible for you to present next, Megan Lang? I guess we'll probably have to.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, thank you, Megan. Okay, so yeah, please go ahead. Megan is going to be presenting on do investments in psychological well-being and non-technical skills complement poverty reduction programs.
Great. Yeah, thank you all for coming. Thanks for having me. This is joint work with Ed Soule and Catherine Tinsley from Georgetown. And this is actually a fairly early stage still. This is the first time we're sharing it with an academic audience. So looking forward to all of your questions and comments. So to briefly motivate, I'll try not to spend too much time here since this is not the audience that really needs the motivation, but as Kate pointed out, psychological well-being does seem to have impacts on economic behaviors and economic outcomes, and that's something that's becoming better and better established in the literature. Something that we've also seen is that psychologically motivated interventions could actually be good complements to traditional anti-poverty programs, but we've usually seen them kind of evaluated as part of a bundle, for instance, in graduation from poverty programs. So here we're trying to get at a little bit of the value add for these psychologically motivated interventions when they're kind of delivered on top of existing interventions. So in this paper, we'll be asking whether a workshop designed to promote a sense of agency, a training on non-technical professional skills, or CASH leads to the highest psychosocial and economic gains for women in Rwanda, specifically when it's delivered on top of an existing intervention. So the context that we're looking at here, we'll be working with an organization called Resonate, and Resonate developed all of the content that is going to be delivered in the workshops that we're studying here. So they've done this over 7 years, delivering both of these workshops to women and girls throughout East Africa. Now, one of the reasons that Resonate is going to be a really great partner for this paper is that their entire model is to always complement and enhance partners' programs. So they're never going to be delivering these workshops to women who aren't already involved in another organization's interventions. In the case of this particular paper, we'll be looking at a partnership that Resonate developed with CARE International Rwanda. So CARE implements a wide range of programs, but for the participants in our particular study, they've taken part in things like financial literacy, the development of women's savings cooperatives, and some training around gender-based violence prevention and response. So these are all fairly low-income women. They all come from the lowest two socioeconomic categories in Rwanda. We have a fairly wide age range from 23 to 75, and these tend to be rural farming communities. So 88% of these women primarily work on their family farms. All right, so the first intervention that we're going to be studying here is what Resonate calls storytelling for leadership. This is going to be a 2-day workshop, and it starts off with defining leadership really broadly as being proactive in the face of a challenge. From that point, participants go through an exercise where they identify their values, and then they spend most of their time developing and sharing a story about a time when their actions reflected those values. And so the way to think about this intervention is that it's really trying to build a sense of agency, but it's really supposed to be rooted in past achievements and actions. Now, the second workshop that we'll be studying here, we're just going to call professional development. This is going to be much more skills focused than storytelling for leadership. So it's also going to take place over 2 days, but the focus is going to be on things like effective communication and public speaking, networking, goal setting, and seeking out opportunities. And this is, something that Resonate has developed to be able to target to the type of population that we're working with here. And then finally, instead of having a peer control group, we'll be benchmarking both of these workshops against cash. So here, the per participant cost of both workshops is around $35 or 32,000 francs. That's about double the average monthly income for our individual participants at baseline. So this is certainly not a negligible amount of resources for these women to be controlling, but of course, this is going to be much smaller than some of the other large-scale cash transfer programs that we've seen in the literature. All right, so in terms of how this happened, we did a baseline survey from August to September of 2019. And then after that baseline survey, between September and October, we got all of our treated participants through their assigned workshops. So this was 6 workshops in total. We always use the same facilitator from Resonate, so tried to keep it as constant as possible. And as soon as those workshops were over, we implemented the cash transfer. So we had intended to go back for a 6-month and a 1-year follow-up survey, but our 6-month survey kind of intersected exactly with the beginning of COVID shutdowns in Rwanda. And so instead, what we'll be showing you today are just results from an online survey that we got out into the field in November of 2020. All right, so in terms of the outcomes that I'll be showing you, what we did is pre-register 3 families of outcomes. So we have our primary psychosocial outcomes. These are outcomes that we predicted to be the most closely linked to the workshop content. We then have secondary psychosocial outcomes that we thought were less directly linked. And then we have a small set of economic outcomes as well. And in practice, you'll kind of see that our guesses about primary and secondary outcomes didn't necessarily come to fruition. And so there's not huge differences between those 2 categories. And so everything that I'll show you are just these outcomes regressed on treatment dummy variables, controlling for baseline levels for each individual. And I'll be kind of trying to show you what's surviving our multiple inference corrections as well. All right, so these are our outcomes that we kind of are calling our primary psychosocial outcomes. On the vertical axis, I'm just describing each outcome. And here the asterisks are showing you the outcomes that are surviving our multiple inference corrections. On the horizontal axis, I'm just showing you the magnitude of treatment effects, and these are all standardized for ease of interpretation. And then you'll see blue is storytelling for leadership effects, whereas red is going to be professional development. So right off the bat, what you can hopefully see is that professional development really doesn't have any significant effects on this family of primary psychosocial outcomes relative to our cash control group. But we are seeing some effects from storytelling for leadership on things like problem solving and connectedness to the home and village. Now, one thing that we were a little disappointed not to see is that we don't actually see changes in leadership here in terms of formal leadership positions held or holding any leadership position. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple slides. Now, in terms of our secondary psychosocial outcomes, we're seeing fairly similar patterns. So again, we're not going to be seeing impacts really from professional development, but we are seeing some significant effects from storytelling for leadership. So up top here, we have the subjective social status evaluated 5 years ago. And we also have effects here on subjective social status evaluated currently. And the increases there are kind of in line with what we see for our self-value score as well. And so it looks like this general sense of self-esteem or of kind of how you conceptualize yourself is increasing. What we also see from both storytelling for leadership and professional development are increases in the extent to which our participants identify as a leader. And so that seemed a little bit odd to us, given that we didn't see some of the effects on formal leadership positions that we might have expected. And so what we did is tried to dive into our data a little bit more to see if we could see any evidence of less formal leadership happening. So this is not a pre-registered outcome, but what we did is pulled out a survey question where we asked participants if they had spoken up in a group situation where they didn't know anyone or everyone present in the last 2 weeks. And so what you can see in this graph is that participants in our Storytelling for Leadership workshop are significantly more likely than those in our cash control group to report that they're speaking up in those situations. This is about a 9 percentage point effect. And we also just have some qualitative information on where they're speaking up. And so what we see is that they're speaking up in markets, particularly around sensitization and enforcement of COVID regulations, also in family and neighbor dispute resolution meetings, and in cooperatives when new members are showing up. And so it seems like part of the way to reconcile some of our seemingly contradictory results here is that storytelling for leadership might be creating this sense of agency that women are taking into these more informal interactions in their day-to-day lives, even if we aren't seeing kind of that translation into formal leadership roles. Now, these are the last kind of outcomes from our secondary psychosocial family. These are kind of forward-looking outcomes, and you can kind of see that across the board here, we're not really seeing very many effects. The one exception is this achieved last goal outcome. So here we actually asked participants to tell us at baseline if they had a goal for the next 6 months, and if so, what that was. And at Endline, we asked them to tell us if they had achieved that goal. And we're seeing here that women in professional development are significantly more likely to actually have achieved that goal than women in our cash control group, and at a lower level of significance also than women in storytelling for leadership. Now, what's interesting is that that pattern actually carries through when we start looking at economic outcomes. And so here we're also seeing that professional development participants have higher incomes and are more likely to be earning any income than our cash control group when we look at our Endline survey as well. So basically where we are right now is that it seems like storytelling for leadership is fairly effective at improving a range of these psychosocial outcomes, whereas professional development really doesn't do much on those psychosocial outcomes, but it is effective at helping participants achieve their goals and improving some of their economic outcomes as well. So in the couple minutes that I have left, I can just talk briefly about one dimension of heterogeneity that we thought would be useful to explore. And so here we're looking at heterogeneity by age. We're just going to split our sample into women who are over versus under 40. And so what you can see here is that, first of all, this is all going to be at a lower level of significance. We're kind of going to need to go down to a 10% level of significance here because we're pushing the data a little bit far for our sample size. But the patterns on achieving the last goal are really opposite for storytelling for leadership versus professional development. And so here you can see in storytelling for leadership, women over 40 are actually less likely to achieve their goal than those who are under 40. Whereas in professional development, the older women are the ones who are the more likely to be achieving their goal. Now, for professional development, at least, that pattern persists when we also look at economic outcomes. And so here you can kind of see across the board for economic outcomes, we're also seeing that impacts tend to be higher for women who are over 40. So taking all of this together, and to briefly discuss and conclude, again, what we're seeing is that storytelling for leadership is effective at improving a range of psychosocial outcomes relative to cash, but it really has little impact on achieving goals and on economic outcomes. And there's some weakly suggestive evidence here that the impacts could be larger for younger women. And then really in every way, professional development is exhibiting the opposite tendencies. And so we're seeing it has little impact on psychosocial outcomes, but it's effective at improving economic outcomes and achieving goals. And those impacts seem to be driven by women who are older. So a few early implications. One natural conclusion might be that we should target professional development more to older or higher status women who seem more likely to be able to benefit from it. But another way to think about this could be that if younger women are facing internal constraints and they really benefit from storytelling for leadership, it could also make sense to work this as a combined intervention so that they get both kind of those psychosocial benefits as well as the benefits from the skills. And then finally, we just, of course, want to add a caveat here that the COVID lockdown was a really large negative economic shock, and it's something that really could have increased external barriers disproportionately for younger women. And so we want to be a little bit conservative here and not say that we think professional development would never have positive impacts for some of these younger women, but certainly in the context where we were studying it during these lockdowns, that seems to be the case. All right, I'm happy to take questions now, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Megan. So yeah, if anyone would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. And it looks like there is one question here in the chat box. Kathleen is asking, on your confidence intervals for the controlled effects, what is your chosen probability value? What is your sample size? Some of the change values seem high and would be measurable at a different confidence value. In other words, some changes seem to have an impact that I would not discard.
Yeah, no, sorry. So I'm using 95% confidence intervals kind of throughout, and here our overall sample size is just above 450. So you could roughly think about each of our treatment groups having roughly 100 people or 150 women in them. So yeah, that's definitely right. I was trying to be consistent throughout, but you're certainly correct that a lot of these impacts are going to be, especially when we start looking at heterogeneity, they're going to be significant at the 10% level, even though clearly they're not significant at the 5% level. And in terms of our multiple inference corrections, it actually doesn't usually end up mattering. And so most things that are surviving at a 5% level, you know, we don't see very many additional effects surviving at a 10% level. But yeah, that's great. Let's see.
Supreet, looks like you're up.
Thanks. So one of the interventions, the one that just had effects on the psychosocial outcomes, I guess I'm just trying to think about how to interpret that, because the kind of outcomes that were listed there were kind of instrumental ones. So the fact that they don't actually translate into changes in behavior, should we think about those and actually as effects? Because, you know, if I say that I feel more, like I feel like I'm, you know, more empowered, but then I don't actually go and do something more empowered, or so I think maybe this is something that maybe we can return to in the broader discussion, is how should we interpret self-reported psychometric measures like these, especially when we don't see them changing behavior? Then is it just sort of cheap talk because somebody saw, you know, a story and then felt like, okay, I should respond in this way?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And that's a little bit of what we were trying to get at, looking at kind of some of those like peer-to-peer leadership effects. And of course, like now we wish that we had tried to think of more kind of concrete outcomes like that we would have been able to study. But yeah, I think part of what that suggests to me is that, you know, that intervention is very much oriented around being proactive in your community. And it's not necessarily oriented towards these economic outcomes to the same extent that like the skills-based training is. And so it's completely possible that we are not looking entirely in the right domain for some of those outcomes. And the fact that we see women speaking up more in some of the day-to-day interactions that they're having, you know, advocating for themselves and their communities, could be a sign that, you know, we're just not fully capturing correct domains there.
Thank you so much, Megan. So I'd love to invite Catherine. I think you've got a new laptop, so we'll try out the presentation now.
Thank you. That is exactly what happened. But I hope this will work, and sorry for the snafu before. Can you see this? Is this looking good?
Yeah, works.
Okay, great. Excellent. All right. Well, I'm in great company. Very glad to be part of this panel. I am Catherine Thomas. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate in social psychology at Stanford, and I'll be presenting on experimental research at the intersection of the Cash Plus and graduation model literatures, behavioral development economics, and cultural psychology. This work was conducted with colleagues at Stanford and Niger, the World Bank, and many other places. So to orient us, Niger is a country in the Sahel, the southern edge of the Sahara Desert. An already arid climate, it is experiencing growing impacts of climate change. And today I'll present data from the Sahel Adaptive Social Protection Program, which is a government scale up of a multi-component poverty reduction program that aims to help women grow and diversify small businesses, and reduce extreme poverty. So our sample is low-income rural women who are eligible for the program. Population is predominantly Muslim and has particularly strong gender norms. Niger is one of the lowest income countries globally and has one of the highest fertility rates. And women in our sample have little to no formal education or access to mobile phones. Notably, in these remote, low literacy and low resource environments, women's economic opportunities and supports often come through their relationships. So on est ensemble, or we are together, is a phrase that is commonly said. Generally, this is an interdependent sociocultural context with tight social norms, and I'll get back to this more in a few slides. So in this context, we'll examine two research questions. First, we'll look at whether at the impacts of psychosocial interventions in a multi-component poverty reduction program and whether they can add value. And second, we'll assess mechanisms by which these interventions might impact economic outcomes. On poverty reduction. So we conducted a randomized experiment with 4 arms and a sample of about 4,700 households. The control condition included a small cash transfer. The capital arm was in essence the graduation model of BRAC that included multiple components such as savings, coaching, business trainings, and a cash grant. And then we assessed variance on that model. In particular, the psychosocial arm substituted out this lump sum cash grant with a community level sensitization and individual life skills training, which I'll focus on today. And the full arm included all components. So the community level sensitization was an evening session that introduced the government program to each village. It included a 20-minute film featuring the story of Amina, a woman overcoming climate-related economic challenges, and was followed by a group discussion. These use role modeling and social consensus techniques to promote social norms and aspirations that be supportive of women's economic engagement. And Amina's story in the film conveyed both independent and interdependent models of agency, which I'll return to in a few slides. And later, the beneficiaries also participated in a life skills training, focusing on problem solving, decision making, and other skills. And we combined these interventions in this multi-level way with a hypothesis that the individual level behavior change would be more likely to occur when social norms are also supportive of these new behaviors, particularly in more interdependent communities. So what do we find? We see that all 3 treatment arms alleviate household poverty as assessed through consumption and food security. The psychosocial arms impacts grew and caught up with the other arms at 18 months. And we also see positive impacts of all arms on business outcomes. And based on these consumption impacts alone, the benefit to cost ratio for the psychosocial arm was particularly impressive, being 126% at 18 months, and the full arm almost breaking even. Both were more cost effective than the cash grant arm. To note, these benefit to cost ratios are approximately 2 to 8 times larger than estimates for graduation programs in other contexts. And I'll point you to the working paper in the bottom right that was just released last week for more on these outcomes and others. So next, we'll move to the mechanisms that might be driving these impacts. And I'll show you some preliminary evidence here. So we'll be examining 2 models of agency and seeing which might be more effective. The first model of agency is an independent entrepreneurial model, which is often at the heart of many entrepreneurship programs and economic development programs. It is grounded in the pursuit of personal goals and self-advancement via self-direction and ambition. And this model is typically more associated with Western, middle-income, and masculine ways of being. It can be reflected, for instance, in a personal initiative training that's been found to boost entrepreneurs' outcomes in Togo. The second model was an interdependent solidarity model, grounded in the pursuit of collective growth and social harmony via processes of social coordination and collaboration. This model is by comparison more associated with non-Western, lower income, and more feminine ways of being. And a couple of papers that reflect this more interdependent approach, for instance, show that social support can boost women's entrepreneurship in India, and framing university as reflecting communal values can increase the outcomes of first-generation college students in the US. So note that both of these models can be motivating. However, one is more likely to be practiced and to be a better fit with a particular context. And we expected that situating women's economic engagement as reflecting interdependent agency would be a better fit for women in rural Niger. Now, why do we think this? Let's put some data to this. So we asked our subsample to rank 4 qualities in terms of their importance to a woman's economic success. 2 reflected the more Western independent economic model, hard work and self-initiative, and 2 reflected more interdependent qualities observed in qualitative research, that of peace and good relationships. And we found that the 2 interdependent factors were seen as more important, with women ranking peace or social and inner harmony as the most important factor, followed by having good relationships. And peace is a particularly important construct in this context for Muslim women. Interestingly, when we ran an elastic net regression with about 40 psychosocial predictors, sense of peace was one of the strongest psychosocial predictors of business outcomes, in fact, so these models seem to reflect something real in the world. So we conducted a pre-registered lab in the field experiment with a subsample of about 2,600 women. And note that this sample was slightly different from the main trial. It was in a subset of communes. These are more Hausa speaking, slightly more distant from the capital. In the sample, so after women saw the community sensitization with Mina's story, and right before they start the bulk of the multi-component program, we assigned them to a control condition, which received no additional intervention, an independent initiative, or an interdependent initiative intervention. So both of these models of agency were reflected in Mina's story, and these interventions are turning up or making more salient one particular way that women could think about their economic engagement in these business trainings and opportunities or another. So we then conduct a follow-up survey at 1 year, and note that we expected the effect of these to be quite small given a small intervention in an already treated arm, but we wanted to get some indication of which of these mechanisms might be stronger. So the first intervention portrayed Amina enacting a more Western independent initiative model to economic advancement. I'll play a 20-second clip and kind of narrate what's going on of this 4-minute video. So in this film, women see that Amina is described as being proactive in pursuing her goals. She's innovative in her products. She plans out her finances herself. She's strategic in the marketplace. And her goals are to advance her socioeconomic status and become a standout entrepreneur. Then women are led through a guided exercise in which they identify effective entrepreneurial strategies. They visualize and set personal goals, and they problem solve around possible obstacles to those goals. So this exercise was based on a motivational strategy developed and tested in the West and personal initiative training in Togo. The second intervention portrayed a more interdependent initiative approach, which we expected would be more culturally matched. In this film, women see that Amina is described as being peaceful, respectful, and generous in pursuing her goals. She collaborates with women and with her family, including her husband. Her goals are to advance her family's socioeconomic status and become a respected community member. And again, these films show economic models being mapped on to particular behaviors and ways of relating to others. So in this exercise, this is an adapted version to be more interdependent. So to focus on effective social strategies, set collective goals, and problem solve around possible social obstacles. We look at a composite measure of business performance at 1 year. This is comprised of investments and earnings. And we see that the interdependent initiative condition has a significant positive effect on this composite score of business performance over the control group, while there's no difference of the independent initiative condition in comparison to either of the other conditions. We see that this is driven by marginal impacts of the interdependent initiative condition on both sub-indices of investments and earnings, particularly business assets, number of businesses, and profits. We see that both motivational interventions had similar small psychological and social benefits, suggesting that both models might be psychosocially compelling. However, the fact that only the interdependent initiative intervention translated to business outcomes suggests that it and its associated behaviors were a better fit for this context. So at a high level, we find that these brief psychosocial interventions can add meaningful value to economic components of poverty reduction programs when appropriately timed and tailored. We find here that tailoring psychosocial interventions to an interdependent model of agency that highlights solidarity and collaboration was a better fit in this context and fueled improvements in women's business outcomes. And broadly, we suggest that culturally tuned behavioral science has the potential to accelerate poverty reduction while also being socioculturally inclusive, being attuned to and preserving more interdependent ways of being and relating. For more on this theory and applications to other development spaces, please feel free to reach out and I can share a recent article that Hazel Marcus and I have written on this topic. Thank you to our team and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Catherine. Okay, if there are any questions, please do raise your hand.
I think Frank has a question.
Frank, would you like to?
Yes, hi. This is really fascinating. One question I had, which went by a little bit quickly, was whether it looked like there's no interaction between the different treatments arms, like the psychological arm and the cash arm, when compared to the joint treatment effect. Is that right? As in, like, these are thought to be additive from what I saw in your table. Is that right?
I think it depends on the outcome. So in some cases, they are additive. In some cases, they actually, well, so for instance, we see that they do different things on business revenues. The psychosocial arm seems to affect agricultural revenues, while the capital seems to affect livestock, and they do seem livestock revenue. And so they seem to have some additive benefit, but they also have independent effects. And we think that this might reflect different pathways.
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting to understand in which cases there might be complementarities, as in like in which cases they might reinforce each other, in which cases they might crowd out each other, or in which case they're just sort of independent from each other, and perhaps why. But anyway, very interesting work. This is really cool.
Thank you.
Kate, if you'd like to go ahead.
So super exciting to see this. I wondered if in the sort of first part, the extent to which you can disentangle the aspirations and life skills component from the sort of more traditional parts of the ultra poor model, like the sort of first part of the table. So you had the savings and mentoring, and there were a range of other interventions. So I just wanted, it's the whole bundle of those things.
Correct. We only had the whole bundle. We basically, the way that we're able to tell the difference between the benefit of the capital and the benefit of the psychosocial is by looking at the full in relation to the other. So the limitation that we talked about in the paper is the fact that we have this kind of core set of additional programs. But we do see in many cases differences that suggest that there is a benefit of the cash or of the psychosocial, and making that comparison.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Okay, so I'd love to invite Anita Shankar to share her slides. She'll be presenting on nurturing personal agency, aligning beliefs, thoughts, and feelings to advance human flourishing.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I am a medical anthropologist, so I feel like I'm coming in here with a slightly different perspective. I'm an associate scientist at the Department of International Health, at Johns Hopkins University. And I'm also the executive director of the Self-Empowerment and Equity for Change Initiative, or C-Change at Hopkins. And I'd also like to acknowledge my collaborators, Genevieve Smith, who is the associate director at the Center for Equity, Gender and Leadership at the Haas School of Business at Berkeley, and Hannah Marca, who's a research associate at Hopkins. Let's see, how do I? Okay, here we go. Just a quick overview of the presentation that's going to be slightly different than some of the previous ones in the past. I'm really just kind of giving an overview of the research around personal agency and our approaches, in large part to let you know what C-Change is trying to address in terms of its challenges, some of the research results from our pilot data from Kenya and India, and randomized control trials that we completed in Kenya and Rwanda. We also did a number of field evaluations. I'm going to pick some data from those with off-grid energy entrepreneurs. And then I'd like to end with by introducing you to the Self-Empowerment and Equity for Change at Hopkins. So C-Change really is designed to address the critical challenge in empowerment programs globally. We all know that personal agency is a central component of empowerment and required for behavior change. However, I found it very difficult to find, I found very few actually evidence-based interventions that incorporate personal agency approaches even within their empowerment and development programming. I can see now that there's definitely a lot more that's going on. Megan, I was really excited to see Resonate because I know the folks there in Rwanda as well. So that was really great. And I don't really need to go through this example, but for the public health folks, this became really an important thing, because we would, in any of the entrepreneurship programs, they would have a young woman, we'll just call her Ankita, and so you would see that she'd be given goods and services or access to starting new business, and she also had kind of links to credit institutions. And the hope is for a lot of these programs that this was going to lead to the outcomes on well-being, creating a business, improving her economic condition and contributing in the community. But it doesn't always do that. We've found often that it doesn't do that. And what we realize that if Ankita has doubts about her ability to start the business, what if she doesn't know how to communicate her desires to her family? How does that impact her decision making? And so it really became clear that these kind of purposeful actions require that understanding of how our mind works, how we make decisions, how our feelings, our beliefs and thoughts influence our future actions. And so we were, from more of a kind of anthropological approach, looking at a personal agency intervention that allows individuals to be able to understand their thoughts and beliefs within their larger cultural context, and especially those beliefs that may be holding them back, and how they can shift their own mindset to better align with the goals that are important to them. And so there are often many different definitions of personal agency. We're seeing it as the capacity and the willingness to be able to make decisions and take purposeful actions toward goals that are important for us. And this is it despite challenges that may arise. And when we're talking about personal agency approaches, it's those interventions where individuals understand how their thoughts and beliefs, their values and their emotions impact their actions. And the research that I started in the context of public health with kind of interfacing with economics was in large part because as a public health researcher, I became very frustrated with the lack of impacts of many of our biomedical interventions. And even the empowerment projects didn't seem to acknowledge the role of one's mindset in determining behavior. So the idea of strengthening self-efficacy or personal agency was more like soft skills that researchers weren't really paying a lot of attention to. And even though that personal agency is foundational to strengthening one's resilience, it is very much a nurturable trait. So about a decade ago, I began testing a number of different empowerment strategies and collecting the evidence of impacts. So back in the early part of the decade, I was looking at, it was an empowerment training that it was conducted over 3 or 4 days. It was delivered by local women. It was done with groups of women. And even after this 3 or 4 day activity, we found significant impacts, like a 2 to or 5-fold increase in reported economic conditions, improved health seeking, improved educational efforts, sending their kids to school, and improved interpersonal relationships. Again, this was a pilot for about a little bit more than about 120 women overall. We then looked at the context, very different context of brothel-based sex workers in India. We had to adapt this content significantly. It kind of ended up going over about 2 weeks in smaller chunks. And in this population, there was a lot of health risks. So about 40% were HIV positive. And after 12 months, we were looking at adherence to medications, which dramatically improved. It was a 90% increase in savings and entrepreneurial activities. But one of the things we did not expect, after the course of 12 months, about 35% of those women were able to successfully pay off their debt to the brothel owner and then either start a new business or go back to their village. So as a result of those early studies, we realized we really needed to do more rigorous study. And so we conducted a randomized controlled trial with Kenyan energy entrepreneurs. These folks, both women and men, were given the opportunity to sell clean cook stoves. And we compared this personal agency training. It was the 4 days of personal empowerment and 4 days of the standard business training. On the graph to the left, you can see that selling cook stoves was a tough business. We lost 20–25% in the first couple of months. But what we found, though, over time, and this is over the course of about 9 or 10 months, if you had the empowerment training, you were twice as likely to stay in the business than if you only had the business training alone. And when we looked at sales, we again saw a dramatic increase in sales capabilities if you had the empowerment training. But if you look closely at this graph, there's some clear inflection points as the pattern kind of increases over time. And those inflection points that I think occurred maybe around end of March, I think, and then again in April and June, those were when the NGO provided like a new opportunity or an incentive to purchase the cook stoves at a slightly lowered wholesale price. And that's where we really saw the folks who had gotten the empowerment training taking advantage of those incentives, purchasing more cook stoves and then selling them as well. We've also recently just completed an empowerment training in a humanitarian setting in Kigeme camp in Rwanda. It was a much shorter empowerment training. It was 2 days for women and 1 day for their male partners. We're still reviewing the data now, but definitely there is 50% more increase in starting new businesses, a doubling of getting new skills, and increasing just general ability to earn money. We also found a tremendous value of having the male partners be able to be trained. And as a result, there was increased household task sharing within the household. Some sub-analysis that we had done on gender-based violence also appears to suggest that there may be about a 30% reduction in intimate partner violence, both physical and sexual violence. For those of you who want to know exactly kind of what we do, as I mentioned, we work, although it's on personal agency, it's really important to work with groups of individuals because it's that collective agency of the group that helps strengthen the personal agency, and oftentimes women can work together to create a new business. The content is about 30 to 50 hours of content. We have an open source curriculum that anyone can download on the internet. that goes through. Actually, we have one for entrepreneurship, and we also have one for employees. A lot of the focus of the empowerment piece is on personal power, on core beliefs, and envisioning future goals. This program works primarily through the local adaptation and human and the customization. And we have a human-centered design piece of it that helps the local trainers figure out exactly how to take the content and the ideas and make them make sense within the context that they're working in. So as a result of the randomized controlled trials, we were able to get funding to do experiments. I'm calling them field-based experiments. That's not quite what folks have been doing in terms of the economic work that was just presented, but really we're working with organizations through a training of trainer process. And so just some brief data from some of the organizations that we worked with in East Africa. This was looking at briquette sellers. The folks in the blue were those who just got the business training. The folks in the red got the business training and the personal empowerment training. And over time, we saw a real degradation. If you just got the business training and you're involved in selling briquettes, you tended to stop, stop selling because it was quite difficult. But those who were able to be retained in the briquette sellings for the empowerment group not only continued to sell, they increased their income. We also found similar impacts when we're looking at overall income. If you got the personal agency training, there tend to be a shift in becoming a higher seller over time. And this was quite surprising that we were getting these kinds of results despite the cascade training approach that we were using. So now I want to say a little bit about, and in large part from the funding from USAID, we were able to initiate the self-empowerment and equity initiative. Group to integrate this personal agency intervention into their programming and really accelerate the development outcomes. We have three primary pillars for the initiative. First, of course, is building the evidence, really understanding what the nature of personal agency is, and as a central force in human flourishing, how can we use this better to foster this in individuals living in resource-poor settings. For the practice, we have a very robust training of trainers programs, so we hope to be able to scale what works, so really bringing personal agency approaches to individuals, organizations, and other groups. And we also have a pillar around innovation, kind of what are the kind of leading innovations in research, either through technology that can help support thriving and resilient populations. We've been working in over 16 countries and from sub-Saharan Africa to South Asia, and we hope to be able to advance our footprint in another 9 countries, including Costa Rica, Mozambique, and the Philippines. The key difference and kind of the beauty that we see with the personal agency and a lot of these psychosocial interventions is that they appear to be a real accelerator for any program in any sector. In fact, we've been able to gain traction in sectors like energy, agriculture, environment, entrepreneurship, and humanitarian settings, and helping really create the change, creating the change for the people that can make the change that leads to the impacts is what we're looking for. As I mentioned before, we've got a number of different partners, but I would love to be able to find ways to be able to collaborate with more folks from both psychology and economics as we begin to expand our reach. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anita. That was great. And it looks like Timothy has a question, so I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Rush. Anita, my name is Timothy Finney. I'm a first-year graduate student in the International Development Economics program at the University of San Francisco. and I've done some work on austerity. And specifically for your presentation, you talked about the importance of women being able to pay off their debt before moving on to the program for self-empowerment. So how important was it for the women to not have any accumulated debt before moving forward with your program?
So it's interesting. We've done this training in so many different environments, and people are coming in at different levels. For the work with the sex workers, that was really quite challenging, not only in how we had to adapt the training, but kind of the original follow-up on it. These brothel-based workers there was a larger kind of connectivity to other NGOs that had been helping and supporting them in addition to the work that we were doing. So this was really more of an add-on. But what we found was that this shift in understanding that they had the potential and power to and control on their finances allowed them to take up their opportunities more. And so in this case, it's just that they had a lot of debt they had to pay off before they could leave. In almost, so that really varied. And whether they had a debt or not did not seem to impact kind of their kind of personal agency and those behaviors that would either help them either save or try to find out economic opportunities. The folks in Rwanda in the refugee camp, there was very little capability of even trying to start a business. While they didn't have debt, it was just that their agency was really curtailed just because they were refugees.
Okay, wonderful. So I think with the last sort of remaining time, we'd love to just sort of have an open discussion. And I think Dustin will pin all of our presenters to the top of the Zoom feed so that you all are invited to ask questions to any of them. Really, questions about sort of the range of presentations or just ideas that are sort of top of mind for you. So I guess, one question that I would just sort of ask to lead us off, I'm a bit of an outsider to this space, so I would be just curious to hear, since all of you are sort of working in the field, trying out different kinds of interventions, what commonalities are you seeing from the other presenters in terms of the interventions that you're seeing, like in terms of what seems to be most effective? Are there things that are sort of resonating with you from the context that you're working in? Are there things that seem quite different? I'm just curious to sort of put you all in conversation with each other on that.
Yeah, if I could just start on that, I thought, Catherine, the work that you're doing on the interdependence was really critical and lovely to be able to see, for example, differences between the personal initiative and more Western focus. And we've also tried to incorporate all that, although I had not really been able to see it in that way. So I appreciate that, and Megan around Resonate and their curriculum as well in terms of this storytelling. I think one of the challenges that I've seen when you see something on the screen where you're seeing a story of someone else, I think that it can be difficult to kind of take that to yourself and make that your own story. So the storytelling piece about one's own life and being able to connect it into something that's my context that I can take advantage of becomes really critical in actually taking steps. People may feel more inspired, but actually that step to taking those actions needs that kind of incorporation into, yes, this is something I can do.
To jump on that, I would just, yeah, thank you for that, Anita. I was just thinking that some of our results kind of suggest that, similarly to Megan's, that bringing it home, kind of drawing it out of a video and applying it to yourself will have some kind of positive benefits. And so I think that we can think about kind of these multi-level approaches to these psychosocial interventions. So thinking about something at the community level, thinking about something at the individual level, thinking about something at the group level. And I think a kind of next step could be, to try to put those in conversation to better understand where constraints lie and where complementaries might be between the different interventions.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think so. One thing that I didn't mention about kind of the storytelling workshop was that kind of after participants develop that story of self, they also try to develop a story of community. And that's much more about like a time when their community's values were reflected. And I think, that also gets at Catherine's intervention of thinking about, it's not just about the individual, it's very much about like where you're situated in your community and what you can achieve when you're working with others as well.
I think that the thing that actually struck me the most was so that Catherine also finds that in a lot of cases the cash does a huge amount, and what you add on top doesn't do that much more. And I feel like that's a really important question. We've actually really got to get into the weeds on the cost effectiveness of this, because if maybe these things are useful on their own where we don't have resource constraints, but it does seem to me like the economic interventions still have quite a lot of bite. So that struck me a lot.
Kate, that was really interesting that the work that you were doing. I know in the camp that we were working, they had these unconditional cash transfers, and our original trial was to look at gender-based violence, but and we haven't been able to figure out all the various different aspects that had led to it, but a number of improvements in well-being had just occurred in the camp between the time we did the baseline to the end line as a result of having these unconditional cash transfers. So yeah, absolutely.
You can see Imran's got a hand up, I think.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Imran, if you'd like to, I'm gonna ask you to unmute yourself. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thanks, Mahesh. So I just wanted to push on a point that was kind of touched upon, I guess, in all four talks, that when we have these sort of cluster designs, there's always an aspect that the social norm might be changing. And I think it was kind of touched upon a little bit that, the sort of the group-based agency may well change as well. And so I was thinking, can you say a little bit more from your studies about that kind of interaction between individual and group agency? I can imagine sort of three elements of that. One is sort of like Catherine's work, the intervention is specifically designed sort of on either a group or individual based level, or just the physical nature of everybody knowing that they're in the same boat and other people are simultaneously being treated. So I guess, do we have a sense of whether those other elements are important, or whether the results would be the same if just one person in the community were treated?
We actually.
Okay, no, go ahead, Catherine.
I was just going to say, I don't have full results for you yet, but we did randomize the degree of saturation within a group receiving one of these interventions. And we do see some indication that kind of psychological and social impacts are stronger when more of the group was treated. So that provides a little evidence to that hypothesis.
Just to add on that, when we did this in the humanitarian setting, the people who were trained were from the camp. And so when they went back to the camp, what we realized was, especially the male partners who had been trained, once they started doing some of these behaviors like cooking or cleaning in front of the house or something like that, that significantly shifted the social norms within the community. And granted, these are people who were respected already, and the humanitarian setting is a very tight-knit place. So at least within that context, we definitely saw significant shifts.
Yeah, I can say we looked at this as well. So when we did the pilot for this, we randomized whether we allocated people to be treated individually or in a group, and that was quite well powered. And we didn't see a big difference. I think in this particular part of Kenya, it's so women move away from their home when they get married, and we were amazed. So people listed on average only one close tie in their community, and the homesteads are quite spread out. So I think it's probably not the best setting it's the opposite of Anita's setting. It's one potentially where people aren't talking about their goals and aspirations to other people very much. So I think in this setting, it did seem to be more of an individual process, but I definitely don't think that would apply kind of universally.
Mahesh had to run to teach for an hour, and then he'll be back in an hour. Are there other questions? So I guess I'll ask a question, which is maybe one final one, which is, so, you know, if one were to want to go and do something like this, so, you know, a lot of your studies had these amazing results. You know, sometimes they were called an aspirations intervention, sometimes they're called a role model intervention, sometimes it's called something else. And I'm wondering if those differences, if that makes a difference, if there is a real distinction there, because there's different psychometric outcomes I think one would use to measure aspirations versus self-efficacy versus other things. But in terms of what the interventions are doing, is there really something that distinguishes those things? And then my second question is, in your experience, is there like a common type of thing, whatever you want to call it, that one should definitely target for impact?
From our perspective, so people can take a look at our curriculum, and it has the various different exercises, and we draw a lot from positive psychology and cognitive behavioral therapies and mindfulness within the context. A lot of the focus is on self, but also various different areas of life. I think this is a burgeoning field. I think we need to know exactly what all the various different kind of programs are out there, and piece out what is more useful and what's not so useful. But definitely the story of one's life, being able to, you know, become more aware and kind of grounded in who we are and where we want to go, appears to be something that's really foundational.
I can just say, so Supreet, I didn't have time to present this, but we did put in quite a lot of different mechanisms to test this, because we were really worried about it. So we measure self-efficacy, people's growth mindset, their locus of control, and then also sort of preferences and beliefs about returns. And we don't see effects on any of those in the sort of 19-month follow-up. We did see some small effects on the self-efficacy and growth mindset straight after the video. And I think that's often when those things are assessed in other studies. So, you know, from that, in terms of the longer term persistence, we concluded that the aspirations were the ones that were persisting. But I'm the least qualified person on this panel to say anything about this. So we were just kind of going from from what we saw in our trial, that maybe those mechanisms are very effective in other places.
Great. Yeah, I was just thinking, so about role modeling, there's a question of content and process. And I feel like, you know, role modeling is just it's a vehicle for modeling something, you know, so we show different models of agency by the same mechanism of a role model. So I feel like that's one important distinction. And then in terms of one cautionary note, I guess I wanted to say on thinking about measuring mechanisms, and maybe this could explain some of the reasons that, you know, Megan and I didn't see these differential, and Kate didn't see these differential psychosocial impacts in the long term, is that the link between beliefs, attitudes, preferences, things that are kind of in the head, are much weaker links to behavior in tighter contexts. So in lower income, tighter contexts, norms are much stronger links to behavior, at least from a descriptive level. And I don't think these have really been tested out experimentally, but that just could be one reason why we don't see these kind of being as strongly associated with behaviors, or really being like driving the bus in terms of behaviors. So I think there needs to be, I guess my recommendation would be to do a lot more work on looking at norms as well as beliefs.
Great, thank you. So I know there's interest in keeping the conversation going. I don't want to get us too late on our schedule. So we have breaks built in after the open-ended discussion. So what I would suggest is we have questions from Francisco and Louise. For those who want to take the break, please take the break. We're going to start the next session at 10:10. For the panelists, and others who are interested, if you wouldn't mind hanging back for a little bit, so we can also take these questions that are remaining. So at 10:10, the next session will begin. If you need a break, please take it. Francisco, please unmute yourself, ask your question.
Oh, I think he's still muted.
Yeah, we can't hear you.
Nope.
Good.
Hear now?
Good. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Great. Thank you for your great presentations. My question will be more related to the policy recommendations that you will provide with your after you do these interventions, and particularly from the point of view of the cost effectiveness, because as I understood, giving cash to people, yeah, it's very effective, but not all of the governments can have that possibility to give. For instance, I come from a developing country, and right now we are discussing for giving $50 to people, which will be nothing during this time. So how which could be the policy recommendation for these countries that will have constraints to give the assets, the cash transfers? Can they implement these programs, which might be more cost effective, and will if there will be some recommendation for some specific groups, for instance, maybe cash transfer for the low or bottom part of the distribution, and maybe aspirations or some other sort of intervention for other kind of for the rest of the quantile. Thank you.
Actually, before we jump into that, maybe just for time's sake, could we, maybe Luis, could you ask your question as well? And that way the panelists can kind of address both together.
Sure. And my question actually builds on what Catherine just said about norms versus, so a lot of the interventions seem to be internally focused, right? So something about me needs to change, right? I need more confidence or something. And we often think about norms, as Catherine mentioned, as being the problem. In other words, let me start again. The assumption is there are opportunities that exist, and the women somehow lack the characteristics, you know, social, emotional skills, whatever, to take advantage of them. So we're going to build those skills. But another assumption is that opportunities exist, but there would be sanctions on women for taking advantage of them. And so we need to help women weather those sanctions or deal with them or whatever. And so I'm just wondering I'm wondering if the interdependence model is trying to address both. So I'm just wondering what you think about the external versus the internal, since to me, they're both a part of psychology and economics. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thank you so much for bringing that up. That is absolutely one of the reasons why I have focused a bit more on interdependence. And I actually want to kind of address both these questions together. So I think that one kind of low overhead thing that governments can do to increase cost effectiveness is to actually kind of shift community level norms to be supportive of what people's engagement in these programs or taking on these new behaviors. So the intervention that we did was kind of like traveling entertainment. You know, it was just putting up a film, going from village to village, and then carrying out this film and community discussion that took a couple hours in each place. And we don't have that separately as an arm, but I do see that norms shift in that intervention. And I think that'd probably be the reason that they would be most likely to shift. And the other point is my dream design would be a 2x2 of coupling these interventions at the individual level with the community level and kind of seeing which are the primary drivers and if there are complementarities. And I was thinking the same thing about Anita's work and as Louise, and coupling and working with men as well as women. Thank you for that question.
Do others want to add for both of the questions, for either of the two questions?
Only that I'd like to have the public health folks do more of these cash transfers and economic, programming. We're literally making people a little healthier in poverty. There, and I think there needs to be more discussion between the public health folks and the economists. So. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think on the sort of policy recommendations, I don't think we can speak to, you know, that it may be that our results don't hold for much lower levels of cash transfers. I think we did the cost calculations in a very detailed way, and the aspirations interventions cost, you know, for the scale we were working at, like 4,000 people, they're actually not incredibly cheap. It's sort of in the $300 range. So I think they become cost effective when you really scale them, you know, because you have to make the videos and actually get people to people's houses and those sorts of things. They're obviously cheaper than the cash transfer, but you know, if your option is, do you give $50 a person or not? You know, this actually is not as cheap as people might think it. So I think the scale is really important, was the one thing. And yeah, I mean, I agree with Catherine about testing the different approaches against each other. We couldn't speak to that so much. I think though, just from having sat in the kind of focus groups and things, I would caution against saying the individual level interventions are not valuable in these contexts. Like Kenya is a very go-getter, hustle, sort of individually focused place. And the intervention massively resonated with people. And, you know, having time and space to reflect in this group really did seem to have an impact. So I think it's, you know, the local context I really took from Catherine's talk, rather than saying we should always go for community norms, because you know, it's not always going to be that these places are super tightly knit, or that the individual decisions don't matter. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, I guess.
I think just to add on to Keith's point, I mean, part of our impetus also for benchmarking against cash was just thinking about kind of these marginal investments that we often might be thinking of making. And so, you know, I think a cash transfer is something that we would often think of like an inframarginal investment, and if it's like at the scale of Give Directly, but oftentimes governments are going to be able to have the budgets to do something that's a little bit more marginal. And so, you know, in our case, a small cash transfer often isn't outperforming a lot of the other like psychosocial interventions and skills-based interventions. And so when you're thinking about kind of marginal investments, maybe it's a great place to go. But again, for some of these like bigger, more transformative programs, like it's still very possible that you would want to do cash.
Yeah, and I think also from the policy point of view, counting in the mental health benefits and things when you do the cash. And so the cash has these big psychosocial effects even on its own. So I think that's another interesting cost benefit point that we maybe don't do enough. It's like your most effective mental health program may be a cash transfer.
And I guess back to that question about policy, how often are there cost benefit of, you know, kind of the return on investment based on, because or, you know, countries are putting money into things, and oftentimes what you get out of it may not be the most efficient way to do it.
I mean, we always do it in terms of food consumption. So not like disability adjusted life years or those sorts of things. So it's really hard to put, you know, we always see a mental health effect of the cash transfer, but how do you put that in? Like, we don't have a good metric for it. And I think that does lead to it being, the benefits being undercosted in some sense.
Right. And the other thing I want to talk about cost, you know, with digital technologies and things, we have an opportunity, once we kind of have the evidence that something is working, to really significantly reduce the cost of these interventions by having different ways to scale them out, whether it be on smartphones or, you know, there's many kind of using social networks as a mechanism to get this information out is going to be really important. Anyway, it's a real pleasure to be part of this group. So
yeah, lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for that wonderful discussion and those really interesting presentations. It was cool to have so many different studies that were so complementary with each other.